I remember sitting in a meeting with a creative agency. They're sending me a creative deck and I'm looking through the deck and I'm like, that's my photograph, that's my photograph, that's my photograph. That's the greatest thing, is that on this call I can be like, well, I'm pretty sure I can nail this for you. You know, I've even got a little insight into how this was made.
I'm very, very excited to have Chris Burkard with us. I feel like you are the OG outdoor adventure photographer that we were all following in the early days of Instagram.
There's sort of this ebb and flow. It's never always going to be like this.
And what would you give as advice to like young creators who are like, I have the adventure, I have the love for travel, I need to figure out how to make this my life's work and make it my career?
Ross, that's a great question.
This is Creator, the podcast from Matador Network. I'm your host, Ross Borden, and I believe creators are the future of all global advertising. So join me as I sit down with top creators to hear about how they got started, the challenges they've overcome, and the tips you need to become a full-time creator. Welcome to another episode of Creator, the podcast. Today, I'm very, very excited to have Chris Burkard with us. Chris, how are you doing? Where in the world are you right now?
I am currently at home in Iceland, so a new home for me as of the last year and a half. And right now, just evening time, right around 5 p.m. my time. I think are you in the West Coast time or Mountain time?
Yep.
Okay,
yep.
There we go. So yeah, this is a shift, but nowadays most of my working day is kind of pushed into the evening. So I feel like this is pretty par for the course. And Ross, I've known you for maybe 6-8 years now, so it's epic to be chatting.
Yeah. That's awesome. I actually didn't even know you were based in Iceland now. So we'll get into that in a minute. But first, for the listeners, I know that most of them, I'm sure, have probably heard of you, followed you over the years. I feel like you were like the overall, the OG outdoor adventure photographer that we were all following in the early days of Instagram. But tell me, even before that, like before social, before the word creator was even on the scene, like take us all the way back to where'd you grow up? How did you get into photography? And then kind of like what brought you into this world and where you are at now?
My mom brought me into this world. So that was the start, right around 1986, Central California.
Okay.
Truth be told, I was pretty much a hellion in my youth, not the most focused kid out there. And I think that, a big part of it is just growing up in a single parent home and kind of not having a lot of direction. So when I found photography, which was really like at the end of high school, I was around 18 years old. It was more about like connecting with my peers, my friends. It was a group of dudes that were running up the coast of California, trying to surf, ducking under barbed wire fences. And I felt like this kinship to that group. And I, in some way, I felt like my place was to be this documentarian. I was using, a borrowed film camera, an old Canon. And then I was buying expired film from Rite Aid, and I would, go to the 1 hour film developer, and I would develop that film after we'd have some session up in Northern California or Central California surfing. So it was really pretty bare bones. I never in a million years thought that photography would even take me to where it has today. And in fact, it's still pretty shocking. And to be honest, it wasn't something that I ever pictured as like, oh, the camera is the tool. This is it. I to be honest, even today, I don't even care about that. It was always about traveling. It was always about seeing new places. And ultimately that goal of realizing that when I had a camera in my hand, I felt like it opened doors. And I would, flip through the pages of National Geographic and Time Magazine and Outside and dream about going to those places. And so I think that I always looked at photography as a tool to just simply get me out of this small town and out of this, tiny environment. And it did. It took a long time. I don't want to say that, I don't want to illustrate any kind of picture like it was this quick journey, because it wasn't at all. In fact, it was the opposite. But it taught me a lot, and I feel really grateful and indebted to what it's given me. And nowadays, I call myself a photographer, but I also call myself a lot of other things. And I'm pretty proud of the hats that I get to wear. And yeah.
And when did you start to actually, from that early time when you were, documenting your friends' adventures and you were the group photographer, to actually jumping into some of those trips and going on, these adventures through where that camera was taking you? What was the early side of your career?
Yeah. So, I mean, early side, I would say, again, was purely just like surf trips with friends. And it wasn't anything that was like a paid or a career or any kind of focused effort. It was just haphazard chaos, if anything. I think where it changed, where it evolved was when I sort of had that epiphany that like, okay, I wanted to go places. I wanted to see the world. I didn't know much. I had no passport. I had never been on a plane. I had never gone anywhere. I'd never been past the Western US. I grew up in California. And so, for me, the big vacation in the year with me and my mom was like, how far could we drive? Our car. That was it. So I got to see places like, Yellowstone and Yosemite and the Sierra and Utah and everything. But beyond that, I had no idea. And so when I kind of had that epiphany, I put all my attention and focus into like what type of photography is going to allow me to travel. And I was super passionate about landscape photography, but I realized really quickly that that wasn't probably going to be the thing that was going to make money. And so I kind of explored everything, senior pictures, weddings, anything to make a buck. When I chose to quit junior college and I quit my job, being, working some really crappy, job, I was like, I'm going to do anything to have photography become my living. And it wasn't glamorous at all. In fact, it was the opposite. And the very first trip I ever did, again, I'm fast forwarding a ton because I don't want to bog people down with my origin story. But the very first trip I ever did was to Dubai and Yemen and Oman. And that was for Transworld Surf magazine. I had eventually, kind of poured my efforts into shooting surfing, documenting surfing as a surf photographer. And the dream was, to be somebody. I was like, well, surfing gets to take you to cool places. I understand how this works. I grew up in the ocean. I was aware of the culture and how to kind of, I think, tell a story, because that's what I basically did as a kid. And that was my first assignment, was with Transworld. I had scored an internship there, that was, more like more of a hazing experience than anything else. And I learned a lot. It was not easy, but I think that set the stage for so much in my life that I feel indebted to that experience, is what I'm saying. And
Yeah.
learning about magazines, learning about the editorial process, and this is when magazines were everything. The internet was, in its infancy, I would say, and that was it.
Yeah, if you mentioned weddings, I feel like every career photographer, everyone I know in directing, photography, filmmaking who has a badass career now started as sort of a rite of passage filming weddings and doing that kind of stuff to start. And that's a hell of a first assignment. So did you go to Socotra? Where were you guys for that first trip?
We were right over the border of Oman, and we basically just explored the coastline, some remote islands. I think that Socotra in Yemen is probably a little more tourist friendly. This was not.
Hmm.
This was probably 16, 18, 6, 17 years ago, something like that. And it wasn't a place that Americans were, I think, you know, we're traveling. And so we had put Canadian flags on our backpacks, like stickers, on our backpacks. And we just told everybody we were Canadian. And Oman and Dubai were obviously super, super chill and relaxed, but we were trying to get
Right.
out there. And oftentimes when you're going to places where there's surf, you're going to outer islands, you're going to remote areas, you're kind of scouring the coastline, ending up at some little bay, talking to fishermen. So we were doing our due diligence to try and make those trips and those places worthwhile. And it was tough. I mean, those trips, those early experiences, they taught me so much. But if anything, I really realized that I was lacking so much in terms of how to connect with people emotionally. Because at the time, when this is your first experience seeing the world, and all of a sudden you're seeing these moments that look like a Steve McCurry National Geographic cover, and you want to go up to these people and take a portrait, but you have no idea how to interact. You have no idea how to, work with your nonverbal communication. You're using the camera. I am using the camera as almost a filter, between myself and my subject because I was uncomfortable, because it was uncomfortable. And it's an awkward
Yeah.
thing, at first time coming from the West, and you see this culture that you have no idea how they operate, what their lives have been like. All of a sudden at noon, everybody drops down to their knees and says a prayer, and you're like, whoa, this is crazy. And I feel so indebted to those early experiences for teaching me a lot, and it really opened my mind and my heart up to so much.
So for us as travelers and photographers, creators, do you have any quick advice for like photographing people when you're in that situation and you're like, man, I can't not take a video or photo right now, but I don't want to be misunderstood. I don't want to be seen as disrespectful, because I've been in that same situation. It could be like a bit tricky.
Absolutely. I mean, it took me years. I'm not going to say that like this is something that happened quickly. In fact, I would say that's something I really had to like work on for a very long time. I had to kind of prioritize and put in effort. And I remember very vividly in Cuba, maybe 7, 8 years ago, I was on assignment there, shooting kind of a catalog for a brand and shooting some stuff. And I remember walking the streets of Cuba and seeing just amazing stuff. You're on the Great Ocean Road. You're seeing kids like jump into these cracks in the reef, and just women with all different types of colorful, clothing on, and just like the most animated faces. And you want to take pictures of everything, but you kind of have to remember, like, this is people's daily life. Like these aren't caricatures. These aren't people that are there to perform. This is just life happening. And I realized very quickly upon pulling out my camera that it wasn't even me. I watched somebody else. I remember sitting down on this little like kind of brick like inlay right along the road, watching other photographers. This dude with like a big Canon strap and his big white camera, white lens, black camera, start taking pictures of kids. And immediately the kids like stop what they were doing and they put out their hand for money. And regardless of how you feel about that situation, that's just how the world operates in a lot of these places. People don't really want to feel like their photographs are being taken all the time, and they're not as willing. And although that's total, I have no problem with that. There's no problem to me to like pay somebody some money to take a portrait. I do think that it does strip away a lot of the kind of intimacy of that moment, the vulnerability.
Yeah.
And I thought about this. I was like, man, I don't want to be that person, first and foremost. I don't mind, paying somebody for a cool, for a portrait or whatever. But I just want to understand, like, why am I doing this? What is my process? So I went back to my hotel room that night. I remember taking all the stuff off my camera. I had like 2 camera bodies with me. I had this tiny, Sony NEX, like mirrorless cam, and I had like a bigger full frame body. And I was like, I'm going to take the small one. And I had some climbing webbing with me, some old climbing strap. And I like used that as my neck strap, took off my Sony logos, taped my camera. And what I realized really quickly was that like I was unobtrusive. In that moment, I had sort of approached photography not so much as this, like, I'm a professional, see me, I need to be seen, but more like I want to just be a fly on the wall. So first of all, my camera became a lot less invasive. Secondly, my approach, like I just stripped down. I put my board shorts on. All I had was this one camera, one lens. I didn't have a bag with me of a bunch of different stuff. And I walked down to the Great Ocean Road, same time. It was like afternoon. Kids are just playing. They're just, jumping into the reef. And I remember putting my little bag down, putting my stuff there, and I just jumped in and started swimming. Started swimming with the kids. So I jumped off this thing 3 or 4 times. And immediately upon getting up, like I was just one of them. I was just hanging out. And then it became this kind of casual exchange where like I pulled out my camera, I took a photo. There was like this equal amount of respect. And that experience, and I'm sorry, I know this is like a long story, but it taught me a lot.
No, that's what I wanted. Yeah.
Yeah, it taught me a ton, and it taught me so much about the idea of trying to like interact and realizing that the connection first, always. Like if the goal is to immediately pull out the camera, which was my experience in that first trip to the Middle East, you're not going to get the results you want. People are, they're thrown off, and I can't only blame myself because I didn't know any better. And nowadays my approach, having gone to a lot of these places, remote Russia and India and et cetera, I really want to capture an emotion, but at the same time, it's important to feel it too. It's important to interact. So I always reserve the opportunity, the privilege of pulling out my camera when I know that I've in some way kind of connected with this person. And that doesn't mean you need to always speak the language. Nonverbal communication is powerful. But there have been moments, in India where I'm finding myself sitting in someone's home holding their baby and, for a long time. And then all of a sudden, like this moment kind of unfolds where I get to take a portrait. And that's like really special. It's something that sits with me a lot deeper than just firing away frames, knowing that I left these people potentially feeling uncomfortable.
Yeah, I love that. I also found that like showing people the photo, when digital cameras came along, when I was traveling to like Africa, like it started with kids. Kids always love to see, and a lot of these kids in these rural areas, don't really get to see themselves a lot. And it would be so awesome to show them the photos you took. Man, I've even found with like older people that like they just appreciate seeing the work and that you're stoked on it, and it's more of a sort of playful interchange rather than like subject and photographer. So you mentioned Kamchatka, the rural trip you did, or the like in the middle of nowhere trip you guys did in Russia. And I remember that was in the early Matador days when we were publishing some of your photos. I think we were broke as a company, and back then, and we were like, I think we were one of the sponsors that you reached out to, and we couldn't scrape the money together. But that I see as like one of the sort of watershed moments of your career, when your career really started to take off, because that trip was so epic, and you guys got so much epic, incredible footage and photos, and had such an incredible experience on that trip. So can you tell us a little bit about that trip, how it came to be, who you went with, and what ended up, being sort of the results?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting. It's interesting you bring that up because I've used that trip as sort of a benchmark for kind of sharing and helping people, maybe like younger creatives, understand the value of like collaborating, and also the value of just realizing that there was a time when social media was really frowned upon in terms of like supporting magazine articles. And so this experience, exactly the one you're talking about, going to Kamchatka, surfing, this really rad remote surf trip, it would not have been possible unless I had basically raised money by bringing on a handful of brands to kind of chip in to make it possible, right? Because I was working for Surfer Magazine at the time. They didn't have the funds to basically pull this thing off. And so I remember reaching out to like you guys and Polar, and Patagonia came on board, et cetera, et cetera. And the point I'm trying to get to is that it was the first time where the magazine let us share moments in real time on social media. And what I mean by that is that we were able to like make posts in the field on Instagram and other channels. This was like early days of social media too. But before that, it was like you can't share anything until the article comes out, et cetera, et cetera. And we had kind of prior to this happening, we had made these relationships saying like, okay, well, Matador is going to publish something online, and Patagonia is going to do some real-time updates, and the goal was that everybody wins, right? Because there's this print article, and then the brands get the ads that they need, and social media was going to play a role. It wasn't so much a time when I think that my following on social media was valuable at all. So it wasn't something where I was necessarily bringing exposure to brands via at Chris Burkard, whatever on Instagram. It was more about just teasing out the trip and creating excitement. And ultimately that's for me, has always been the funnest way to use these tools. And, to support something bigger, a film, a book, an article, a web article, whatever it was. And I also feel, and this is like no disrespect to Matador, but I at the time I knew that I wasn't going to like make some paycheck, but I did know that the followers and the basically the subscribers and the people that saw this channel, it was a lot and it was a big deal. And you guys were having rapid growth. And the way I always saw it was like, this is going to be an inroad to something bigger. This is going to be an inroad to something larger down the road. And I've always been one to advocate for sort of giving exposure for free in some capacity, or trading images for exposure when you feel like it's right. Sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it does, but that was one of those situations where I was like, you know what, this is going to be cool. I know they're going to give it the proper exposure it deserves. And if that, translates to print sales or a book sales or film attendance, because we made a film from the trip and we toured the film, that's where the benefit comes. I think that, to me, I've always kind of looked at partners like working with Matador in those early days of how can this support kind of my other endeavors. It's not always been about trying to like make as much as you can from all these kind of various sources. In fact, a lot of the work I did for Surfer Magazine, like the retainer that I got paid, the money that I got paid from them barely covered the cost of what I was doing. It was more of a means of getting the work in front of other consumers, customers, clients to make money.
Yeah, I've always admired that about you in terms of your savvy of like, I think photographers, a lot of them take sort of a closed stance to sharing their work. They're like, even in the early days of Matador, we were publishing these big photo essays, and where some photographers were like, oh no, this is my rate. And then you got to take it down after 6 months. There's a licensing fee. And we're like, forget it. Never mind. You were always like, are you crediting me? Done. Take as many as you want. And I was like, Chris's photos are better than anyone's. And he's got this like really open stance on sharing his photography. And I think in a lot of ways that's paid off, because that's why you're so well known. Your photos are everywhere, and they all led back to your Instagram or one of your other channels. And then people were able to follow you. Do you have any thoughts on that or advice on sort of that like open
I for
stance?
sure do. And I appreciate you saying that. And I just want to be clear too, like I was never undercutting any other photographer out there in any capacity, because I've always been a huge advocate for like people sharing their fees and understanding what someone's charging so we can kind of keep the rates high. But I'm a firm believer in the idea that we can create multiple streams of revenue, and we can lean into those streams of revenue. For me, a big part of that was print sales or book sales or like I said, film tours. So I was always thinking about, okay, my media partners. Who are my media partners? Well, at the time I had like Surfer Magazine and Surfline and Matador, which was Matador was nice because it would publish a lot of the work that was maybe not always surf related, maybe climbing, maybe a travel essay, et cetera, et cetera. And I always looked at these media partners as like, well, this is my free PR. This is my free press. And yeah, they are obviously publishing something, working with advertisers, getting paid, but what's the value of the exposure? And maybe I'm going to nickel and dime them to charge, 200 something bucks for an essay. I'm like, is it better for me to give them more and receive more exposure that then can, turn people's attention to this book I want to sell, or this, this event I want people to attend? I've always found that fostering those relationships was more profitable than trying to just, collect some small amount of money. And I get it. If that's your only revenue stream is working and publishing work online or publishing work in print, then that's what you got to do. But I think that where I really sort of realized the value is I remember sitting in a meeting with a creative agency, one of the big ones like Chiat or Wyden Kennedy or whatever, agencies that represent the Apples and the Abercrombies and the Harley Davidsons, whatever. And we're sitting there and they're sending me a creative deck, and I'm looking through the deck and I'm like, that's my photograph, that's my photograph, that's my photograph. And they had no idea. And that's fine. That's what creative decks are. They're internal. They're meant to, give the photographer or the production company inspiration. And to me, I'm like, that's the greatest thing, is that on this call, I can be like, well, I'm pretty sure I can nail this for you. I've even got a little insight into how this was made. And ultimately, there was a shift right around maybe the late 2000s, when digital photography really came into its own. And obviously social media came into its own, where, you would see this all the time. People putting, big watermarks across their photograph, right?
Yeah.
And nowadays that's like unheard of, because the point is for stuff to go viral. Is anything going to go viral if it's got Chris Burkard written halfway across it?
Yeah.
No. So there's this kind of give and take. You want the work to get out there. You want it to get in front of the right people, but then you also want it to find you again, right? Like, so, you want that full circle experience. So I kind of realized, well, I'm going to put some of my best work out there online. I'm going to utilize and lean into social media as a tool to share, you know, not just my B and C and D photos, but some of my A photos, some of the ones that maybe didn't make it into the article, or some of the ones that I'm really proud of. And I learned at a certain point that like I could give them more life and exposure than maybe this magazine. And yes, there were times where like I'd publish something and they'd be like, oh, well, we saw this online, so we can't publish it anymore. And I'd be like, that's a bummer. But it still ended up bringing money back. Yeah, Nat Geo, like they'll publish the cover on social media before they'll choose the cover. They used social media as a tool to kind of see what has the most positive response. And I think that that's a great way to use it and to lean into it. And that's kind of the thing that I have tried to adopt.
Yeah, I think it's brilliant. I always admired you for that, and obviously it's paid off. So let's talk about that, sort of your jump from being a photographer to someone people were following on social media to, you know, all the other things you do. You had, or maybe still have, I think, Chris Burkard's studio in Central California. What, you know, your Instagram, you're followed by millions of people, but I feel like you're not on there hawking brand deals most of the time. It's like all of your passion work and stuff that's promoting other things that you're doing, whether it's books or films. So tell us a little bit about like that evolution. Like you, all of a sudden your following is skyrocketing. You're traveling all over the world. What came next in terms of like your career?
Oddly enough, early on, I kind of tuned in, I keyed into the fact that like if I wanted to get my work out there and I wanted to get out of this bubble that was surf photography, because in the beginning of my career, I was like, this is the greatest career choice ever. I live the dream. I have the dream job. And very quickly, you know, the wallpaper starts to fall off and you're like, huh, this is not that great. Or there's a limit. And maybe you want to have kids. You want to have a house someday. You're not going to make it on that budget. Right. And so
Right.
early on, when I published my first book, I got very lucky and I spearheaded a personal project. I received some money from a grant that I won with my photography. I used that money to try and do a trip that was purely focused on making a book. I could have used that money for anything. I could have bought new lenses, you know, bought new tires for my truck. I could have, I don't even know, like, you know, bought some groceries because I was living in my truck at the time, shooting surf photos at the beach. And ultimately, I was like, I want to do a trip about California, a story about the California coast. So I made this book called The California Surf Project. Chronicle Books picked it up. Long story short, when this book got published years later, like 3 years later, because it's glacial, okay, so it's not instant at all of a sudden my photographs were in front of, say, the mom and pop wine store on the California coast, and you know, some little place that sells artwork, and Barnes and Noble. It was everywhere. It's Urban Outfitters. So I was getting my work in front of new audiences, and I really thought about that long and hard. I'm like, this is the answer. This is the key. I need my work to constantly be getting in front of new audiences, because right now I'm just serving the same group over and over. That's why I saw Matador as such a value early days, right? I was researching like travel websites, and I'm like, well, I want to shoot more than just surfing. I have all these epic photos of travel to the wildest parts of the world, but I wasn't getting published there. And I was like, what's wrong with me? So I started to like look into those options. I started to get my work in front of new places. And I guess to answer your question, I try not to, if I can, avoid it, hawk random stuff all over the internet. I really try to focus on doing my very best to get my passion projects, the things that I care about, making films, making books, making stuff that is a story about a friend or a place or a location or a landscape. That's what I would really rather rely upon to make money. And yes, that requires a lot of community support, to be totally honest. But I also feel like people understand that what I'm giving them or what I'm offering them are hopefully stories of meaningful places, people, and things that I care about. And so I guess that's been my model. Yes, I have leaned upon and relied upon commercial photography, shooting catalogs for brands, directing, producing. That's work that I love too. I don't put as much of that out there because I feel very strongly about putting work out in the world that I want to bring back. And that's kind of been my, I guess, my motto.
I love that. And I think a lot of people think of books as like this old school thing that like, an old, pre-internet way of making money as a photographer or putting out work. But you've been very successful with book publishing, not only finding new audiences, but, revenue wise, building your career. How many books have you published, and what has that been? How is that, stacked up in terms of like work that actually pays the bills?
Well, I think it depends. Like it depends on the year, right? Or the project. So I would say that some of the most successful things I've ever worked on, like my children's book, right? This is a children's book that isn't really speaking to my age group at all. I mean, it's as relevant for adults, but this was a project out of nowhere. I made it because I have two boys, and I'm passionate about teaching the youth and trying to like urge them to find answers in nature. Nowadays, that book is at like every national park bookstore. That book has been, it's won awards. I never imagined it being successful like this. There is probably years where a certain project like a book or the film Under an Arctic Sky requires a lot of time and energy. It doesn't always mean it's the most profitable. But what I'm trying to get at here is that there's sort of this ebb and flow, right? And I like to call it rhythm, like the rhythm of business, right? Which it's never always going to be like this. If it is, you're going to burn out, or you're going to become a workaholic, or something is off. And there will always be dips. And so to me, the intelligent, like, creative businessman, whatever, when there are times of plenty and maybe you have extra money to spend, or you're feeling creatively energized, or you've done a lot of commercial work, you've grinded fairly hard, that's when you need to pour your time or your attention or your money into something personal that then will create a PR buzz for yourself that then can hopefully perpetuate more commercial work. Does that make sense at all? Because I know that I'm explaining this like not the very best way, but I have always ridden the wave of excitement around projects over the course of 2 years. And what I mean by that is I'll come out with a film, I will promote that film, and I will see it through, and that will take 6 months or a year. And maybe when I'm doing that, I'm not, this is a personal project, I'm not working as much on commercial projects, right? But I'm seeing that through. And then usually the benefits from those, the benefits from my children's book, the benefits from Under an Arctic Sky, the benefits from other films I've made have come back to me because somebody saw it and somebody wanted to hire me to do something else. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I feel like the personal project and the passion project, they inform the commercial work. I've published now 7, 8 books, and I've tried to have those books be spread out to like 2 to 3 years apart.
Yeah, it's very, very smart. It's kind of like the flywheel approach for finding new audiences, but also, getting the flywheel going for the promotion and the sales of the books. And I appreciate what you said about, taking that as an opportunity when there's a lull, when there's not so much work, you can focus on stuff you're kind of more passionate about there. Tell me about your relationship with Iceland. I had actually no idea that you were living there. Are you living there full time or part time now?
It's full time. I mean, my kids,
Full time.
I'm paying taxes here, so it's about as full time as full time gets. I think I've probably published 2, 3, 4 articles with Matador over the years about Iceland, whether it's a surf thing or whether it was something else. And it's interesting because my relationship with it has changed. So it wasn't something where in the very beginning I even imagined living outside of the US. I came to Iceland maybe 20 years ago, and I was here for a magazine assignment for a men's journal. And I just kind of fell in love on the first trip. I was like, oh, this place is magic. I love it. So different from home. So cool. Like, what an amazing place. And then as I got older and as I had kids, I think that somewhere in the back of my mind, I was like, that would be a fun place to bring them. And what I'm getting at is like the reason I'm here is because of my kids. My kids hit an age where I wanted them to have more freedom. I wanted them to have a bit more of that freedom that I felt. I'm sure that you felt growing up, where you could like go down the street and play with friends until dark and come home. And I just wasn't finding that in California where I lived. And so I wanted to give them a bit more of that independence and show them that to me, nature, access to nature is the priority, not like how much can dad work? How, because I think that it's easy. I mean, and again, I'm just saying for myself, I'm not saying that this is everybody, but I will say that hustle culture is very prevalent in the US. And, nobody ever stops to say like, wow, like you've really like got a good thing going. You should just enjoy this. Everybody just wants to know what's the next thing.
The
What's
next
the next
level. Yeah.
step? Yeah. What's the next level? And to be honest, there is always a next level. And I'm aware of that. And I found myself thinking that way constantly. And so I got a little fed up with that and a little irritated by that mindset. And there's nobody to blame but myself, like I said. So yeah, the reason I came and the reason that we came for one summer, we spent like a week. Came for another summer, we spent like a month with our kids. The next summer we spent 3 months, and we were like sitting back at California, and there was wildfires and it was hot. And I was like, this is not where I want to be at the end of September. And so we just decided to stay, and now we're here. And I guess the reason I'm saying it's kind of like still partial is because I have to go back to the US quite a bit to work, and that it asks a lot of me. It's not fun to be on planes. I think the novelty wears off pretty quickly, as you know. So
Yep.
the Western US still calls, and I love it. I mean, there's nowhere in the world I love more than the Western US. But for a place that I can call home, this has been really special. And I think that it's given me more time with my kids.
So where do you guys live? Do you live in near Reykjavik, or do you live out in the country?
Well, truth be told, we own a little bit of property out in a remote fjord, out in a remote corner of Iceland, which is epic. And we get out there as much as we can, but we live just on the outskirts of Reykjavik. So like my house is in an area called 104, which is like the zip code. And it's nice because you're not in the hustle and bustle of the city, which is a hilarious thing because it's more like a suburb of LA. I mean, it's so
The
small.
hustle and bustle of Reykjavik.
Yeah, the hustle and bustle of the country that only has, under 400,000 people in the whole country. And so, yeah, I get the chance to like get out of town really fast. And there are days where, before I start my morning calls, I'll go skiing and go fly fishing and come back for, a chat like this. And I just feel like it's an amazing privilege. It's been pretty amazing.
That sounds like a pretty good lifestyle. I think you found the balance you're looking for. That sounds epic. So getting back to sort of like the business of being a creator, because like you were saying earlier, you have days where you ski in the morning, fly fish, and then you do some calls. You're living with your family in Iceland. You've kind of like won at the game of life of like total freedom, doing what you love. Yes, a lot of time on the planes for sure. But like, I think there are so many people who want to reach that level, not necessarily of making money, but more of the lifestyle and freedom that you've achieved. What have been sort of the drivers in your financial success as a creator, and what would you give as advice to like young creators who are like, I have the adventure, I have the love for travel, I need to figure out how to make this my life's work and make it my career?
Right. Well, Ross, that's a great question. I wish I would have given myself that advice like 10, 15 years ago or had the answer to that. I would say that first and foremost, I've never been a great person at learning from other people's mistakes, right? Or other people's successes. I feel like I've always had to learn from my own way of doing things, which is usually to fail and then figure it out. In fact, I wrote a book about this exact process called Wayward, which is kind of like a pseudo memoir about all my, life's failures, I guess you could say.
All the Burknar.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, that's part of life is like realizing that at a certain point when you think you have it all figured out, you usually don't. And so I would say that I don't want to get like super spiritual here, but I would say that it's required a lot of introspection to get to this place. That being said, moving to Iceland was one of the hardest things I've ever done in my whole life. I sold my gallery my business, my production studio in California, this massive office that was epic, and I had a climbing wall and, custom artwork everywhere. And I had bought that like maybe 6 years ago. And I was like, this is the dream. This is where we're going to build our enterprise. And I started realizing that like, I never stopped and paused long enough to ask myself, just because I can, should I? The question never popped up. And I think that as we chatted earlier, like, I think that what I've noticed in Iceland, especially, and in Europe, is like there's a big difference between the way people look at capitalism here versus capitalism in the States. And I guess I just wanted to really understand, like, is there a point where I can just be satisfied and I can just be happy and I can actually spend the time? Because coming from like a blue collar family, big time, and the idea of saying no to work was like sacrilegious. It was like, you don't do that. If opportunities are coming to you, you take them all. And I prided myself on being more busy than you or her or him or whatever. I prided myself on being the person who like, well, I'll say yes to that job or I'll do that job or I'll whatever. It's okay if I'm going from one to the next to the next. And all of a sudden, you have kids and your kids become of age because in the early stages of having kids, like they don't notice if you're gone, and then all of a sudden they do. And then you realize like, well, this is taking a toll. And again, I don't want to like, I don't want to, but I do want to lead with a little bit of vulnerability that it's hard when like you wake up one day and you're like, well, work is the thing I'm good at. And what I don't think I'm good at is like being a parent or being a husband or being a friend. And so I tried to put life on pause a little bit and reflect more on what I want. So I guess what I'm getting at is that unless you pause and think about what that means to you, like what does success actually mean to you? Is it a number in your bank account? Is it a number of followers? What is it? What does it look like? Right? And I think that I had to reflect on that pretty deeply to kind of come to terms with that. But I would say that what did, set me up, I guess, early on was I didn't go to college. So a lot of those years that people spent partying and, doing all the things you do at college, I didn't do. I worked. And so I just want to be realistic about like the sacrifice. I got married at 21. I had kids at 26. I went straight from high school to my first, to trying to make a career out of this. And there wasn't much time wasted. There was no debt. It was just basically living in my car. So that being said, I think that not having a plan B, not having a backup plan, it really helped me because this was it. This was the only option.
No safety net.
Yeah,
You just
none.
had to go for it. Yeah.
And I know this is probably like the worst piece of advice to give anybody. I feel like this is not what, maybe you were expecting to say, but like, I do feel like, I would have been maybe more successful, made a few less mistakes had I just honed in a little bit more on what is it? How am I going to define success? When young creatives ask me the question that you're asking me right now, in some form, I always ask them the same question in response. And I say like, well, what is success to you? How do you define it? And if, for example, if success is a destination that has an actual ending point, only then can I or you or somebody much wiser than both of us offer directions. But if people have no idea what that means, if people have no idea what success means and does success mean happiness, then they're never going to get directions. They're never going to get, nobody's going to be able to guide them to that place that doesn't exist. So I think that is the advice that I've given myself and thought about. And I think I spent years of my career just trying to find success without any determination of what it meant. And I think when I finally honed in on making a name for myself, it all changed. And I feel like you guys were a critical part of that. Like when I started to hone in on going to places that were cold water destinations, where I felt like I was making a name for myself, where I was maybe going to locations that were a little more risky, a little more challenging, where the images meant more, where I was actually loving the work I was doing as opposed to just like phoning it in for the magazines. It started to build a reputation, and it started to set me up for more success in the long term.
Yeah, we're getting a little philosophical here, but I
I
think
know, I'm
that's good.
sorry.
And I think people's, that endpoint that people have of happiness or success, it changes as you get older. Cause I was the same way. I was like,
Yeah.
It is a dollar amount. It is, I want house here, house there. Like now I look around, 2 healthy kids,
Yeah.
my wife, like freedom with my work.
Yeah.
It's better than any dollar amount. So
Dude,
yeah,
you're right. I mean,
think that's really important.
able-bodied. Like I feel so lucky just to be able to be healthy and be here. And I know we are getting philosophical, but like, isn't this what we do as we get a little older? we
100%. Yeah. And that's also what travel inspires you to think about and give you some context. And not to hate on America, but I do think there is this sort of like hustle mentality that you can go overboard in that hustle mentality. And I've met people older than myself who kind of like snap out of it when they're in their, 60s or 70s, and they're like, holy shit, I worked my whole life. I didn't
Yeah.
stop to slow down and enjoy the things that I had. So I think
Right.
it's an important lesson. All right, man, we got to wrap up soon, but something I ask, well, two things I'm going to ask you. One, again, you've been down, more crazy adventures than almost anyone I know. What is another place that's on your bucket list still? One of these like sort of remote or non-remote
Yeah.
adventures that's still on your list that you're like can't wait to do.
One place I was dreaming about for a long time is I really wanted to cross Lake Baikal, which is in Russia. It's the lake, it's like one of the biggest lakes in the world, and it freezes over. And what I was fascinated by was the pilgrimage that people had made for thousands of years. I mean, it has always been almost like a superhighway for trade. And it was, I mean, I don't know all the facts about it, of course, without, reaching into my notes, but I had wanted to go. I wanted to cross it on bike. I wanted to cross it on a car. I wanted to go photograph it. I dreamt of like photographing people riding horses over it, because this is what they have done for hundreds of or thousands of years on this lake. It became a trade route in the winter. And I'm fascinated by places where you can take the beauty of storytelling and weave it into history and weave it into a narrative that like helps to kind of remind people of, I guess, something that we've forgotten about, I guess you could say, and also just stunningly beautiful. But I think that at this point, traveling to that country might be hard, and obviously not something that I think is safe, nor do I want to support. So yeah, I mean, there are trips and places, the Kerguelen Islands, which is a small island, kind of just above kind of Antarctica, that I've wanted to go to, but it's nearly impossible. You need like a scientific vessel or permission to get there. And so I guess at this point, I'm not going to say my bucket list is full, but like it's almost harder and harder, because the places I dream of going are more remote, more expensive, need to find that funding to get there, that super big project to kind of take you there. But I'm also super content, like going back to the places I've been before, pouring more time and energy and having a deeper connection with them. I've sort of been that guy who realized a long time ago that I don't want to just get more stamps in my passport. I want to actually invest myself in certain communities and become like somebody who I think is valued for their time they've spent there. So it's brought me back to Russia and the Faroes and Alaska and Norway and Iceland, et cetera, et cetera. And that's been
Yep.
really, really cool too.
So perfect lead into a question I ask everyone who comes on the pod. So if your passport only worked in 3 countries for the rest of your life, you had to choose 3 places to live. And I think I'm going to know 2 of them, maybe, or at least Iceland seems like going to be on the list, but I won't speak for you. 3 countries for the rest of your life. You can go nowhere else. What would they be?
So you can't like cross a border, even if that country is like
No.
connected. Okay. That's a,
You're like,
that,
even on horseback, if the lake freezes over. No, I'm saying only in the 3 countries. I'm curious to know where you were going with that, but it's got to be three
would,
countries.
would Alaska be its own country, or would it be part of the US?
Part of the U.S. Yeah, it's
Okay.
a U.S. passport.
I mean, the US, I just, to me, there's nowhere with more diversity. And it's obviously, it's massive, right? It's hard to even process how big it is, but US for sure. But, and I feel like Iceland's cheating because I live here and whatnot, but I would say New Zealand.
Yeah.
I could really get down with New Zealand. I've been there a lot. It's so special. It's kind of the best of both, because you can have all that terrain that you find here and there and everywhere. And just for, pure kind of, I guess you could say, I was going to say shits and giggles, but you can cut that out if you want. But I would say maybe Norway, because it's got some of the wildness of Iceland. It gives me that, that craving, that sweet tooth, like sort of experience of being in a place like this, but it's so big that you can get all the way south and have that warm weather, and you can get all the way north and be fully in the Arctic. And I think that it's a little more broad, and it's awesome to experience. And I love Norway.
So I'm not going to let you off here, though. That's 4 if you include Iceland. So
no, I'm not.
Iceland is not on the top 3?
It's not. No, I mean, if I had to, if I had to. And again, like,
interesting answer.
I'm thinking of places where I know my family would enjoy it and they'd have fun and we'd have a good time. So
yeah, that's important. All important stuff. Awesome, man. Well, it's great chatting. Congrats. When did you move to Iceland? What's the timeline on this big move?
It's about a year and a half. So it was like maybe June of early summer of last year, basically. So.
Well, congrats on the big move. What other new projects should we look for coming out from Chris Burkard in the next year?
Yeah, thanks. So actually, I'm right now in the middle of doing a photography guidebook, which is sort of like the Chris Burkard's version of photography guidebook, which is basically kind of like a play on Zoolander's, like, center for kids who can't read good and want to learn how to do other stuff good too. If you know what I mean and you understand my humor. And what I mean by that is, like, I'm not going to tell you all the minute details. It's more about what you need to know and nothing else, and how to, like, get by, when you don't have a tripod or you don't have a polarizer and you can use your sunglasses. And, this is what I would kind of implement when you're out in the field and you're trying to, like, get creative, grab a leaf and pull it in front of your lens, just stuff that's applicable and practical application. I wanted to make a guidebook that people would actually put in their backpack and have with them in the field. And so it's been a process. We're doing a lot of illustrations for it because I want it to be fun and I want it to be actually very usable, and sort of like steer very clear from all of the very intense manuals that are already out there, because that's not what I need to make. So I'm working on that, and I just finished a film tour, or I'm finishing a film tour it finishes in November, for a film called The Forgotten Coast, which was a bike pack rafting expedition we did in Iceland. That was, again, it was like weaving through history of Iceland's most dangerous coastline and the most dangerous coastline in the world, and why, and people who kind of like risk their lives to create a home and an environment in this area. So anyway, it's a cool film. It's been touring around the world. We're showing it in North Carolina next week. I'm flying there back to the States. And then it's showing at the Kendall Mountain Film Festival in the UK. And then after that, we're going to put it out online. So those are the two things I'm kind of working on and I'm really proud of. And yeah, man. Yeah.
Cool. Congrats, man. So
it
sounds like a lot. I'm excited to see more adventures in the future.
Yeah.
Appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on. And
thanks, bro.
You are the first person I'm hitting up next time I come to Iceland. That's
Please do. I deserve it. You need to.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Creator the Podcast is produced by Matador Network. We are a leading global travel publisher focused on travel and adventure. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe. Every week, I interview a new top creator. New episodes are released every Tuesday on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere podcasts are found. Thanks for listening.